In 465 BCE, a woman was dragged into the courtyard of the most magnificent palace on Earth. What happened next was so brutal that even the hardened soldiers who witnessed it couldn't speak of it without trembling. Her crime? Saying no to the wrong man. But here's what makes this story truly horrifying. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was just one day in the Persian royal court. One crime in a decades-long pattern that turned the world's most beautiful palace into a chamber of psychological torture. And the man responsible, you know his name. You've seen his armies in movies, but you have no idea what he really was. History wants you to remember King Xerxes I of Persia as a warrior, as the man who led millions against Greece, as the builder of monuments that defied imagination. That's the story we tell ourselves because it's easier to digest. But what if I told you that behind those golden walls, a different war was being fought? One without swords or shields. One where the victims couldn't run, couldn't fight back, and couldn't even speak their truth without risking everything they loved. What if the greatest atrocity of Xerxes' reign had nothing to do with Greece? What if it was happening right under his own roof, every single day, to the people who should have been safest in his presence? Stay with me, because what you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about ancient Persia. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll understand why this story was buried for over 2,000 years. Let's start with a question that historians rarely ask. What does it actually do to a human being when everyone around them insists they're not human at all? October 486 BCE, the throne room of Pepololis. A 36-year-old man named Xerxes receives the crown of the largest empire the world has ever seen. His father, Darius the Great, is dead, and from this moment forward, Xerxes will never again experience a single genuine human interaction. Think about that for a second. Every person who approaches him must follow an elaborate ritual called proskynesis. Falling face down on the ground, kissing the earth before him, not bowing, not kneeling, completely prostrating themselves as if before a deity. No one can turn their back to him ever. To do so is death. No one can look directly into his eyes unless given explicit permission. No one can speak unless spoken to first. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded something chilling about Persian court protocol. If you had to approach the king with urgent news, you first had to stand outside the throne room for days, sometimes weeks, waiting for permission to enter. Even if the empire was burning, even if cities were falling, you waited, because disturbing the god-king at the wrong moment could cost you your head. But here's what makes this truly insidious. Xerxes wasn't born believing he was divine. He was systematically conditioned into it. His mother, Atossa, understood power better than anyone alive. She was the daughter of Cyrus the Great, the empire's founder. She'd watched her own family tear itself apart in succession wars. She'd seen brothers poison brothers, seen entire bloodlines erased overnight, and she knew the brutal truth. In the Persian court, family wasn't a source of love. It was the most dangerous threat of all. So she taught her son a lesson that would poison everything he touched. Trust nothing, control everything, show no weakness. Because the moment you're seen as human, the moment you're seen as vulnerable, you're already dead. The Greek sources tell us Atossa had enormous influence over Xerxes, more than any father figure or advisor. And what she created wasn't a king. She created something far more dangerous. A man who genuinely believed that other human beings existed only as extensions of his will. Now, let's talk about the place where this all unfolded. The royal household itself. Hollywood gets this spectacularly wrong. When we picture ancient Persian kings, we imagine some kind of eternal bachelor party. Hundreds of wives, endless pleasure, a fantasy of absolute indulgence. But the reality was far more complex, and in some ways, far more disturbing. The Persian royal household, called the Anderun, was actually a sophisticated political institution. And contrary to popular belief, Xerxes appears to have been married to only one woman throughout his entire adult life. Queen Astress. Think about the implications of that. This wasn't a harem of disposable women who could be ignored. A mistress was a permanent fixture, a woman of immense power in her own right. She owned vast estates. She commanded her own household troops. She held audiences with foreign dignitaries. She controlled major construction projects across the empire. But here's the catch that makes this entire system so psychologically twisted. All of that power existed at Xerxes' pleasure. With a single word, he could strip it all away. The royal household was home to the most powerful women in the empire. The king's mother, his wife, his sisters, his daughters, and the wives and daughters of his closest relatives. These women lived in unimaginable luxury. They wore robes worth more than entire cities. They dined on delicacies brought from every corner of the known world. They were attended by hundreds of servants who existed solely to fulfill their wishes. But they were also prisoners. The Greek physician Ctesias, who served at the Persian court decades after Xerxes' death, left us descriptions of the royal household that sound like something from a nightmare. The women's quarters were sealed off from the outside world by massive walls and locked gates. Male visitors were forbidden entirely, except for the king himself and a small number of eunuchs who'd been castrated specifically to serve in the Anderun. The women could look out from high windows at the city below, but they couldn't leave. They could hear the sounds of life beyond the walls, but they couldn't participate in it. They had everything except the one thing that matters most: agency over their own existence. And here's what makes this even more horrifying. This wasn't seen as oppression. This was seen as honor, as protection, as the highest privilege a woman could achieve. The women themselves had been raised from birth to see this cage as a palace, to see their powerlessness as power, to see their isolation as intimacy with divinity itself. This is what makes systemic control so insidious. The victims internalize it. They defend it. They can't even imagine an alternative. For decades, this system functioned exactly as designed. The official Persian records, carved into stone monuments across the empire, speak only of order, prosperity, and divine harmony. Everything was perfect. Everything was controlled. And then something went catastrophically wrong. Here's where Herodotus enters the story. Writing about 30 years after Xerxes' death, he recorded an incident so disturbing that scholars have debated its authenticity for over 2 millennia. And I want to be clear with you. Herodotus was Greek, writing for a Greek audience who had every reason to hate Persia. His account could be propaganda. It could be exaggeration. It could even be complete fiction. But the details he provides are so specific, so psychologically precise, that they deserve our attention. According to Herodotus, sometime in the late 400s and 70s BCE, after the disastrous Greek campaign, after Xerxes had returned to Persia in humiliation, the king developed an obsession with the wife of his own brother, Macestes. This woman's name isn't even recorded. History didn't bother to preserve it. Let's call her what she was: a victim. She was married to one of the king's most powerful military commanders, a man who commanded armies and governed entire provinces. She was a mother. She was, by all accounts, living a relatively normal life within the constraints of royal culture. And Xerxes wanted her. Now, this is where the story gets psychologically revealing, because Xerxes didn't just take what he wanted. Remember, he believed he was divine. He believed that everything and everyone existed for his pleasure. But even with all that conditioning, some part of him apparently still sought consent, still wanted to be desired, not just obeyed. So he approached her, made advances, made promises, and she said no. Think about the courage that took. This was the most powerful man on earth, who had absolute legal authority to take anything he wanted, who had executed people for far less than refusing him. And she looked him in the eye and said no. For most men, that would have been the end of it. Even for most tyrants, there would have been consequences, but the matter would have ended there. But Xerxes wasn't most tyrants. His conditioning had taught him that his desires were cosmic imperatives. That resistance to his will was a form of disorder in the universe itself, something that needed to be corrected. So he didn't give up. He simply shifted his focus to her daughter. Artante was probably in her late teens or early 20s. She was Xerxes' own niece. And unlike her mother, she apparently didn't have the strength, or perhaps the awareness, to refuse. The affair began. And here's where it gets even more twisted. Xerxes, who'd been rejected by the mother, now had complete control over the daughter. And some part of him needed to prove that control, to demonstrate his power in a way that would hurt the woman who dared to refuse him. According to Herodotus, Xerxes promised Artante anything she wanted, anything in the empire, name it, and it was hers. And Artante, whether manipulated into it or genuinely desiring it, asked for a specific robe, a magnificent, one-of-a-kind garment that had been personally woven by Queen Amstris herself, incorporating gold thread and Persian royal purple. It was a symbol of the queen's status, unique in all the world. Xerxes gave it to her. Now, let's pause and think about what this means. Xerxes wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that giving his mistress his wife's personal garment was a deliberate, calculated insult. He knew it would provoke a mistress. And on some level, he probably wanted it to, because this is what absolute power does to empathy. It doesn't just diminish it, it inverts it. The suffering of others becomes entertainment. Conflict becomes sport. Other people's pain becomes proof of your own supremacy. When Queen Amstris saw her robe on Artante, she understood immediately what had happened. And she planned her response with the cold precision of someone who'd spent her entire life navigating the brutal politics of the Persian court. But here's what makes this story transcend simple palace intrigue. A mistress didn't target Artante. She targeted Artante's mother, the woman who had refused Xerxes in the first place. The woman who was, in every meaningful sense, completely innocent. According to Herodotus, a mistress waited for the perfect moment, the king's birthday celebration, a massive feast where Persian custom dictated that the king had to grant any request made of him. It was a sacred obligation witnessed by all the most powerful nobles of the empire. In front of everyone, Amstris made her request. She wanted the wife of Masistes delivered to her as a gift. Xerxes understood immediately what this meant. He begged Amstris to choose something else, anything else. He offered her cities, wealth, armies. But Amstris was bound by the same code that bound him. The request had been made publicly, and it could not be refused. The woman was delivered to the queen's custody. What happened next is so brutal that Herodotus himself struggles with the description. Amestris had the woman mutilated in ways specifically designed to destroy everything that made her a person. Her breasts were cut off. Her nose, ears, lips, and tongue were removed. And then she was sent back to her husband in this condition as a message. Let me be absolutely clear. This is one of the most horrifying acts of cruelty recorded from the ancient world. It's almost impossible to process the level of sadism involved. But we need to understand the psychology behind it. Amestris wasn't just punishing a rival, she was making a statement about power in the royal household. The message was clear: I am the queen. My authority in this domain is absolute. And anyone who becomes an object of the king's desire, even unwillingly, will be destroyed so completely that they'll serve as a warning for generations. But there's another layer here that's even more disturbing. By targeting the mother instead of the daughter, Amestris was punishing the woman for her virtue, for her refusal, for her loyalty to her husband. The message was, you should have submitted. You should have accepted your dignity, your moral code, your resistance. You should have accepted your dignity, your moral code, your resistance. Those things are not virtues here. They're schemes. The woman's husband, Masistes, responded exactly as you'd expect, with absolute rage. He gathered his forces and attempted to rebel against his own brother. The revolt was crushed. Masistes and his entire family, sons, daughters, everyone, were hunted down and executed. The woman who'd said no, the daughter who couldn't say no, and an entire bloodline were erased. All because one man believed his desires were divine imperatives. Now, here's the question that historians hate, but that we have to ask. Was this an isolated incident, one terrible story in an otherwise normal reign? Or was this a window into something much darker? The problem is that Persian royal records were designed to project a divine order. They recorded military victories, construction projects, religious devotion. They didn't record palace scandals. They didn't record family conflicts. They especially didn't record anything that would humanize or criticize the king. So, we're left with fragments, Greek sources that might be biased, archaeological evidence that hints at things it can't prove, and the psychological logic of absolute power itself. Let's think about what we know for certain. We know that Xerxes was raised in a system specifically designed to eliminate his empathy. We know he was conditioned from birth to see other humans as objects that existed to serve his will. We know he experienced one of history's most humiliating military defeats in Greece, returning home with his ego shattered and his paranoia amplified. And we know that after Greece, something changed. The historical record shows that Xerxes essentially withdrew from public life. He stopped leading military campaigns. He stopped traveling the empire. He retreated into his palaces. He spent the last years of his reign focused on building projects and what sources vaguely describe as private pursuits. What were those private pursuits? The sources don't say, but we know the court became increasingly isolated. We know his sons grew up watching their father's paranoia intensify. We know the power of court officials like Artabanes, the commander of the royal bodyguard, expanded dramatically. Here's what that suggests. The system had consumed even the man at its center. Xerxes had become a prisoner of his own absolute power. He couldn't trust anyone. He couldn't form genuine relationships. He couldn't even be certain his own sons wouldn't murder him, which, as we'll see, was a perfectly reasonable fear. For the women of the household, this period must have been terrifying. A paranoid, isolated god-king with absolute power over your life, your body, and your family. No appeals, no protection, no escape. Then, this wasn't unique to Xerxes. This was the system. This was how the Achaemenid dynasty functioned for over 2 centuries. Xerxes didn't invent this machine. He inherited it, perfected it, and passed it on. August 465 BCE, the palace at Pepilolis. Midnight. King Xerxes I, ruler of the largest empire in human history, was murdered in his own bed. The details are murky because the sources contradict each other. But the most dramatic version of the story, preserved by multiple Greek historians, goes like this. Artabanes, the commander of the royal bodyguard, led the conspiracy. He and a small group of co-conspirators entered the king's private chambers and killed him while he slept. But Artabanes didn't stop there. He executed a plan so cunning, so psychologically sophisticated. He went to Xerxes' younger son, Artaxerxes, and told him that his older brother, Crown Prince Darius, had just murdered their father. He presented false evidence, manipulating the young prince's grief and rage. Artaxerxes, believing the lie, executed his own brother to avenge their father. Only later, when Artabanes tried to consolidate his own power, did the truth emerge. Artaxerxes, realizing he'd been manipulated into fratricide, had Artabanes and all his co-conspirators hunted down and killed. Think about what this story tells us. The king's own bodyguard murdered him. The king's own son murdered his brother. And this all happened within the most heavily guarded palace in the ancient world, surrounded by thousands of loyal troops. How does that happen unless the entire system is completely broken? Unless the culture of fear and paranoia has spread so thoroughly that even the inner circle sees assassination as the only path to survival. Xerxes had spent his entire life building walls. Walls around his palace, walls around his household, walls around his own humanity. And in the end, Those walls didn't protect him. They trapped him. For the women of the royal household, the death of King Xerxes changed nothing. Artaxerxes I inherited the throne, and he inherited the system. The Anderun continued. The practice of viewing royal women as political assets continued. The isolation, the control, the reduction of human beings to instruments of dynastic power, all of it continued. In fact, it intensified. Artaxerxes, his own son, the future Darius II, married his half-sister, Parysatis, in a union specifically designed to consolidate power. This practice of sibling marriage became more common in later Achaemenid generations, until Alexander the Great burned Pepilolis to the ground. The system persisted. Generations of women were born, lived, and died within those walls, never knowing any other reality. And here's the truly chilling part. This wasn't seen as tragedy. This was seen as civilization, as order, as the natural way of things. The gods who enforced it thought they were doing their duty. The priests who blessed it thought they were serving the gods. The women who suffered through it often defended it because they'd been taught from birth that this was honor, not horror. This is what systemic oppression looks like at its most effective, when the victims can't even recognize their own oppression. When the cage is so beautiful that you forget it's a cage at all. The ruins of Pepilolis stand today in the Iranian desert, their columns reaching toward the sky like broken fingers. Tourists walk through them, imagining the glory that once was. But those stones remember different things. They remember the women whose names weren't recorded, the voices that weren't heard, the lives that were lived entirely at someone else's pleasure. The story of Xerxes' household isn't just ancient history. It's a warning that echoes across every century and every civilization. It shows us what happens when we build systems that place any human being beyond accountability. When we confuse power with divinity. When we convince ourselves that some people are born to rule and others are born to serve. The palace is ruins now. The empire is dust. But the lesson remains. Absolute power doesn't just corrupt the person who holds it. It corrupts everyone who participates in maintaining it. It twists love into control, duty into fear, and human beings into instruments. And that's not ancient history. That's happening right now, somewhere in the world, behind walls we can't see.